Rachel.
I'm Andy.
I'm Felina.
And I'm Thomas.
And we're going to talk to you today about communication accommodation theory. So how many of you guys have realized in conversations with your friends that you talk very differently to your friends than you do your parents or your boss? Like maybe you talk to your friends in like vines and memes, and you can't talk to your boss that way because they have no clue what you're talking about. Like I've explained to my boss the shared one brain cell meme like 5 times and he still doesn't understand it. That's sort of what communication accommodation theory is you changing how you speak to different people, is you accommodating to them to make sense to them into your language with them. So we're going to go through our activity first, and then we're going to really explain to you what communication accommodation theory is and how it works and the different terminology that goes with it. And then we're going to go into how communication accommodation theory is impacted by the technological age, how communication accommodation theory applies to language and accent differences, and then outside factors like success and failure and how they impact communication and accommodation theory as well. And then we're going to wrap it up and do our question and answer period. So I'm going to hand it away to Tommy, who's going to explain the activity to you guys.
Okay. So hey guys, we're going to play a little game called Headbands. So we're going to need 3 people in the audience to volunteer themselves willingly. Right now.
By the way.
Yes, please, please, please.
I have a bag full that really needs a home.
We'll give you chairs.
And there's prizes.
It's an activity, guys. Y'all gotta engage. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. One more person.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alright, so really quick, we're going to do a little demo of how this is going to work.
Thank you. Perfect. Yeah, we're going to do a demo. So Felina's going to be a boss, and I'm going to be her subordinate. And she's going to ask me questions, and then I have to respond in a way that sort of indicates to her what our relationship is.
Alright, so Emily, will you go to a wedding with me?
I don't know how I feel about that with how our relationship is. So something like that, you can go into more detail or elaborate. We have several rules which...
Yeah. So these 3 lovely gentlemen have graciously volunteered themselves to essentially play the game. They're going to be given roles that they don't know what they are, and they're going to need your guys' help, the audience, to essentially help them figure it out. You're going to essentially act out how you would act in front of like a boss, a coworker, or a peer. You're given the roles. Given the roles that are listed up here. They're going to be one of these roles, but they don't know what they are. Or they can look up because these are their options to choose. And there's going to be about 5 rounds, and each of them has 3 lives. And after every round, they can take a chance and guess what role they are, and if they win, they get candy. If they lose, sadly, you know, they lose.
But they still get candy.
Yeah, they still get candy. It's a good
And
time.
anybody that participates gets candy.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so guys, you've been assigned your roles. So go ahead and just go in order however y'all want to, and you can ask the audience whatever questions are on the list.
We asked the audience?
Yeah,
yes.
you ask the audience.
And you don't have to ask all of them.
Yeah.
Just whichever ones you think will help you
Like
discover
figure
your
it out.
own.
Okay. So am I assuming, is it appropriate for me to ask this question based on the role?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I'll go first. Where can I get a fake ID?
Yeah, they're supposed to help you out.
So how would you guys respond to
This person asking you if they knew where
You
you're
don't
at.
have to ask my brother.
You don't need
I'll respond like I
wait till you're 21.
Oh, so
You don't need one.
Nah, bro, you gotta do it.
Yeah, why would I do that?
Oh, I guess I'll go.
Yeah.
Will you help me move?
None of you are willing to help this person move?
Can y'all not read that card? Is that what y'all
I
want
can
to
see it.
You
But
can?
You can see?
what was the question?
Will you help me move?
Would you help this person,
Like move?
like, out of
To
their
a new
house?
home.
No.
Nah. Probably not appropriate.
Oh, Jesus.
Would you like to go to a happy hour?
Would you guys go?
Okay, good.
You would?
Sure.
Alright. Would you guys like to guess what roles you are now? Or would you like to ask another question?
I'll ask one more.
Alright. Remember, 5 minutes.
Can I see your answers for the homework?
I guess.
Yeah. If you never check it.
Yeah,
Yes.
you want to check? You can check for me.
Check the homework.
I can check.
You can check my homework.
You don't check it before you turn it
Yeah. If you don't check it and I do bad, you might get mad at me.
Am I like a parent?
in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Big.
I don't care how many pieces.
Take out.
Well,
Yeah,
obviously,
yeah,
leave it enough for
Am I
other
supposed to be the
people.
kid?
All the roles are up there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even see that.
Because they accommodated you.
Wait, can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Actually, will you go to happy hour with me?
No.
No.
Instantly shut down.
No.
That's one of your lives.
Man, it depends. Really cool professor. Really cool professor.
You're,
You have to
you're
wait
allowed to
till
ask
next-
again.
Yeah, next round.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. How do you
It
feel
depends on
about
the really cool stuff.
How do you feel about him?
Like John Middle? It depends on which one.
You want to guess? You want to ask another question?
That's what I'm saying, it's like, which one?
Okay, yes, you can ask your question.
How do you feel about me?
Sometimes I
It
like
depends,
you.
yeah.
Sometimes I really don't like you.
I'm a professor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow, this is great.
I'm the boss.
No.
Nah.
You can ask your, you can ask some questions. Oh, please take it. I'm
You
not.
think they thought
Okay.
it was.
You need to rotate your thing a little.
So they
Can
can
y'all
see
see that or no?
Not anymore.
Do you mind if I
But we
rotate
all know
this?
what it is, yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. Sorry.
How big we meet?
You're asking all of the rights.
Snapchat.
I slid in your DMs.
Oh, for real or something?
I'll try to get it.
And please take a candy. Okay, but before you guys go back to your seats, I want to ask you guys, how did you know what roles you were? Like, how did you know out of the options what you were? Like, what gave it away?
I mean, just some questions were appropriate, like, and then they gave me some good hints. They were like, you know, sometimes they'll double check stuff with me just to make sure I'm doing things right. So it's like a role model. That's what I was thinking of. So most of those don't really fit role model unless you're like a professor, maybe.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, basically what put there. Sounds like
And you didn't get it, but you did a great job anyway. Thank you.
Look, my defense, man, that first question, I didn't answer it right. But then on the second one, though, I really had to do like something about the friend. See, I don't even think it's significant. So I don't know. It's a good thing, though.
And this is essentially what a communication accommodation theory is. It's how our behaviors change. And Andy will get more into that for you.
Okay, so in 2016, Howard Giles wrote an article describing what communication accommodation theory is, and he also described key aspects of communication accommodation theory. So the first aspect would be communication influencers. Things that influence our communication would be the immediate impressions we get from people and our initial orientation to the communication we have with those people. But in addition to that, we also have socio-historical context. Socio-historical context, an example of how that impacts communication would be, so imagine that you are a citizen in a country where there is police brutality against citizens like yourself. If you were to encounter a police officer in this country, you would probably have tension and maybe a feeling of dread. Maybe you wouldn't, but there's a chance that that socio-historical context would impact your communication in that situation. The second factor would be negotiating memberships. So when we're communicating, we're not just sharing facts, ideas, and emotions. We're also trying to negotiate your social category membership. So, for example, Howard Giles, he was talking with his British relatives. He was an American citizen. He used to be a British citizen, but now he's an American citizen. And they were asking him questions to kind of understand what his social category was. And after the conversation, instead of listening to his overt responses, they kind of determined that he was more of an American citizen depending on the way he communicated and the impressions that he gave them. The third aspect would be expectations. So we have expectations depending on situational, social norms, and stereotypes about out-groups. We have expectations about how much is appropriate accommodation for us, whether there's non-accommodation, over-accommodation, or under-accommodation. And over, under, and non-accommodation are things that we use to describe how much we accommodate others, which is a good segue into convergence and divergence, which would describe what direction we accommodate other people. So convergence and divergence are strategies that we use to communicate with people and signal our attitudes about this communication. Convergence being the us changing our behavior to be more similar to the interactant that we're communicating with, while divergence is our strategy where we sort of distinguish ourselves from the interactant that we're communicating with. So I'm going to take it over to Rachel. Sorry.
So I'm actually going to discuss a little bit more about convergence, specifically in computer-mediated communications, such as email, instant messaging. How many of you actually use Slack for work or at all? Any of you? Okay, a few people. So the study that I looked at was conducted by Monica Riordan and some of her colleagues. And they noticed that communication in face-to-face experiences, nonverbal cues include things such as facial expressions, accents, and rate of speech. These nonverbal cues are not necessarily present in computer-mediated communications. So any nonverbal, other than written, nonverbal cues that we have in computer-mediated communication, that's a long word, it's CMC for short. Any nonverbal cues we have in CMC is actually going to be more important because there are fewer. So what they looked at is time-related structures such as message length and response time and instant messaging. And they found that the degree of convergence depends on the relationship and situation in the conversation. For example, if two people are, engaging in a persuasive conversation, they're less likely to converge, especially if they are strangers, for example. one other thing that they found in their research is in email individuals that have faster responses, they lead to more positive interpersonal perceptions in supportive emails and task emails, and in emails from job candidates. Similarly, longer responses had interpersonal positive perception as well. Felina is now going to explain how language barriers and accent impact communication accommodation theory.
Thank you, Rachel. So I wanted to ask the class if anyone here has a first language that is not English. Right, so a lot of us, me too. My first language is actually Spanish, and I started to learn English when I was in kindergarten. I had to take English second language classes all throughout kindergarten to 6th grade, and that helped me enhance my English language. Whenever I was in 4th grade, my family moved to Nebraska, and over there I lost my Chicana accent, which sometimes comes out. Moving back to Texas and being around Hispanics helped me bring my accent back, but it is something that I am sometimes subconscious. I don't feel like it helps my communication, I'm sorry. I wanted to share a little statistic about North Texas DFW. This data that I found online shows how 31.9% of Dallas-Fort Worth citizens speak another language that is not English. And so we see that number 1 is Spanish, second is Vietnamese, and third is Chinese. This is going to be a big part of our future professional lives because we're going to be we're going to be interacting with people who have different languages and different accents, and we're going to need to know to accommodate. So I want to talk about a little bit about under accommodation. Under accommodation, as Andy explained, is whenever we do not accommodate to those who we are talking to, and in a way that hinders our message. It may not be sent to the person we're talking to. Some people do it on purpose, unfortunately. They like to be divergent. They want to be set apart. Sometimes they want to feel better. And so it's just not helping the message get across to the other person, which may affect your business. I also want to talk about over-accommodation. And so over-accommodation happens when the speaker tries to emphasize what they're talking about, even though it may not be needed, hence over-accommodation. And so we, as a speaker, we might talk too much or explain too much or enunciate too much to the point where it's not needed anymore. And so throughout the dissertation that Mahdi Rahimian talked about, he mentioned that people prefer over-accommodation over under-accommodation because most of the times it comes with good intentions. And so it's something we're going to be dealing with throughout our whole lives, especially in Dallas-Fort Worth, since there are so many languages here. And so we should know that it's better to over-accommodate because it is with good intentions instead of under-accommodating. So, thank you.
So clearly through Felina's point, we understand that language and accents can play a role in how accommodated a message receiver feels when they're in a conversation. Another outside factor that plays into the communication accommodation theory is success and failure. So in a 2018 study published by the Routledge Academic Journal titled Effects of Instrumental Success and Failure on Perceptions of Under-Accommodated Messages and Sources, they sort of played with this idea of success and failure. And so they gave all of their participants a map like this, except it was of a fictitious town, and they gave them directions. So start at Lot N, take a right on Loop Road, take a left on Drive A, and then they would do a last message which they described as objectively under-accommodative, like pick the building north of JSON. Okay, well how are you supposed to pick between ATEC and the Alumni Center? So through that study, they found a lot of different things. One that, so if you say, let's say it was ATEC, that's the building that they had chosen. If you clicked on ATEC versus the Alumni Center, you would get a message saying you were successful, and if you clicked on the Alumni Center, you'd get a message saying you failed your task. And so through that, they discovered that people who succeeded found this message, this objectively under-accommodated message, to be accommodated even though it's not. whereas people who failed were complained that it was under-accommodated, and they also complained that it wasn't perspective taking. So in the study, they described perspective taking as the creator of the message taking into account your needs when they create the message. And it plays a lot into the accommodation theory as well. So a lot of people who failed found that things weren't taking on their perspective. So one good example I can give is like when a professor, when you fail the test in a class and your professor is sort of like apathetic about it and is like, well, you should have just done the reading yourself, and you're like, okay, but you didn't explain this one thing, we never saw it, we never talked about it, that sort of thing. And then they also found that through failure and success that you could have the same message and take a different perspective or a different perception from it. So because you succeeded, you thought it was accommodated. Because you failed, you thought it was under-accommodated. And then negative perceptions discourage people from interacting further. So again, if you fail the test and your professor is like, okay, well, SOL, then you aren't going to ask that professor any more questions about that class because you feel like you don't have anything to ask them. This applies to work and stuff in that, like, have you ever gotten an assignment from your boss where your boss just does not elaborate on what you need to do at all? They just sort of like, here's a vague thing, and just sort of go out into the world and hope for the best, and you produce the content and you give it back to them and they're like, okay, no, this sucks and it's not what I wanted, and you should have known it's not what I wanted, and you're like, but you didn't tell me that. So that's a good example. Another one is from a classroom perspective. I'm taking ITS 4330, which is the Systems Analysis and Design class, and our professor gave us a grade back, and we all got like 5 points off of the grade because we didn't have three methods in the class diagram. And she was like, when we complained about it, she was like, well, you should have known that you needed to have at least three. And I was like, well, you didn't clarify, it's not in the textbook, how are we supposed to know? So outside factors play really big into the idea of communication accommodation theory. It's something that they didn't really elaborate on until recently, or realized that language and accents and things like that, things you can't control, are going to play into how you perceive a message.
So in conclusion, you've heard Andy go through the basics of what communication accommodation theory is. You've heard Rachel talk about the technological aspects of it. You've heard Talia talk about the language and the accent aspects of it. And of course, you've heard Emily just recently talk about the negatives and the successes of it. And if there's one thing I want you all to take away from this is how you accommodate other people, how much more welcoming or how much more you're willing to work with these people and show that you're willing to work with these people really will affect how successful you are in your career. Okay. And now we'll be taking any Q&As, anything you guys want to know, and so on and so forth.